Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. We've been eagerly awaiting this occasion. I think it's safe to say, and I asked Hartmut about this, that this is really, in many ways, the first occasion where he has engaged a raft of theologians in North America. So we're looking forward to this exchange over the next 2 days. And to lead us off today, we have Professor John Swinton from the University of Aberdeen, where he is the professor of practical theology and pastoral care. John has published widely within the area of mental health, dementia, disability theology, spirituality and healthcare, end-of-life care, and pastoral care. So without further ado, John, I welcome you to the dais and invite you to present. Thank you so much for being here.
I discovered this week that my eyesight is beginning to go, right? So I don't have reading glasses, so I have to decide whether to read from this or from my iPad, right? So if I stop suddenly, it's because I can't see anything. So I'm going to address the issue this morning as a practical theologian. And one of the things there's two things that practical theologians like to do. The first is to ask the question, so what? So you've got a lovely, interesting theory, big deal. What does it mean? What does it look like? And the second thing that we tend to do is to complexify things, to take complex issues or to take simple issues, or issues that look simple, and make them complex. And when we make them complex, really interesting things begin to emerge. So this morning, I want to use Hartmut Rosa's sociological theories to complexify a phenomenon that you may never have thought about before, which is this self-diagnosis of mental illness. And I want to complexify that in a way that gives us a specific way of thinking about it theologically. In other words, I want to think about what the real-life implications are for Hartmut Rosa's theories. So I want to look at how Professor Rosa's theories of social acceleration and resonance can help us understand the curious phenomenon of mental illness diagnosis being appropriated out with of a medical context. So the phenomenon manifests in two distinct ways, linguistically and digitally. So linguistically, it surfaces in casual phrases like, I'm a little OCD, or I'm so depressed, or my boyfriend gives me PTSD. These statements beg the question, why do people seek to identify with serious mental health conditions when they do not actually experience them? The digital amplification of this inclination emerges on social media platforms, which often encourage and even pressure individuals to identify with certain forms of mental illness. In the digital context, algorithms are effectively replacing psychiatrists in diagnosing and labeling mental health conditions. So I want to utilize Hartmut Rosa's theory of social acceleration to clarify and complexify the phenomenon before exploring the implications of his theory of resonance for offering a practical theological response. So social acceleration and mental health. Mental health problems are on the rise in Western culture. Hartmut Rosa's theory of social acceleration provides a persuasive causal explanation for why this might be. So in his influential book, Social Acceleration, A New Theory of Modernity, Rosa introduces the concept of social acceleration. This theory provides a critical lens to examine the increasing pace of social change, technological progress, and lived experience in contemporary societies. Now, Rosa points to three interconnected dimensions of social acceleration: technical acceleration of social change and acceleration of pace of life. Technological acceleration refers to the speeding up of purposive, goal-directed processes, including transportation, communication, and production. The acceleration of social change denotes the increasing rate at which social institutions, practices, and relationship patterns transform. Finally, the acceleration of the pace of life describes the subjective experience of time scarcity and the compression of actions and experiences in shorter periods of time. So Rosa argues that social acceleration intensifies alienation and disconnection. This leads to a loss of resonance, a meaningful connection with the world. This in turn contributes to the formation of mental health challenges such as anxiety, depression, and burnout. All of these things are really important. That's a very solid analysis. But there is, however, another mental health dynamic relating to his analysis, which is not so obvious. The cultural movements Rosa identifies are not only causing mental health challenges, they're also creating new and revised forms of mental distress. While these new forms of mental health challenge share similarities with traditional understandings, they differ in at least one crucial way. They're the product of personal choice and identity formation. The reality is no longer solely shaped by mental health professionals. Instead, individuals who may not meet clinical diagnostic criteria are increasingly constructing and appropriating mental health diagnoses. People use diagnostic labels to understand themselves, and from there develop identities, meaning, and community. As a result, mental health diagnoses are shifting from clinical indicators of deep psychological suffering to personal expressions of preferred identity. So the shifting landscape of mental illness, the symptom pool. The historian Edward Shorter introduces the concept of the symptom pool to illustrate the fragility and transience of recognized and legitimized symptoms within a culture at any given time. The symptom pool isn't fixed. It evolves with advancements in medical knowledge, societal norms, shifts in cultural beliefs. For instance, homosexuality was removed from the list of mental illnesses in 1973, not due to new scientific discoveries, but as a result of advocacy from gay rights activists who argued that homosexuality should not be defined in terms of symptoms and illness. Economic and political systems can be deep shapers of the symptom pool. For example, a recent New York Times article titled "Recession Anxiety Seeps into Everyday Lives" revealed that people who are very well off are becoming anxious and depressed because of the fear of recession. They have everything, but they live in fear of losing it, which in some senses is an inevitable aspect of neoliberal political and economic systems. While the phenomenon of anxiety remains constant, its manifestations are deeply influenced by culture, economics, and politics. This indicates that mental illness is not a fixed natural category, but rather a socially and medically constructed one that shifts with cultural trends. So how then might self-diagnosis be changing the symptom pool? Trivializing trauma, the linguistic construction of mental illness. The language we use around mental health is deeply formative. The way we describe something determines what we think we see. What we think we see determines how we respond to what we think we see. So our words create worlds, and our worlds create actions. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with people casually appropriating mental health diagnosis through language. I'm feeling a little bit ADHD, I'm on the spectrum, whatever way you want to put it. It seems innocuous, maybe even amusing, but it's not. Take, for example, how the diagnosis of dementia has been weaponized in the current US elections. Here we find an aggressive misapplication of a diagnosis in an attempt to humiliate and disregard opponents. How must such weaponization of a diagnosis be experienced and processed by people living with dementia? In the war of words surrounding the battle for the White House, there is serious, if not as often unnoticed, collateral damage. Descriptions matter. So the term casual diagnosticism seems fitting here. Much like casual racism, where language unconsciously reinforces stereotypes or downplays harm, causal diagnosticism trivializes the reality of formal mental health diagnoses. When people casually refer to themselves as a little OCD, for instance, they unwittingly diminish the profound suffering that accompanies the genuine condition. This reduction of complex mental illness into mere personality quirks not only depathologizes the condition, but also marginalizes those who live with the deep psychological pain that they entail. Such casualization goes beyond flippant remarks, seeping into a broader social trend that trivializes serious mental health struggles. The diagnosis of obsessional compulsive disorder is a good example of this. In his book, The Man Who Couldn't Stop, OCD and the True Story of a Life Lost in Thought, the scientist and journalist David Adam explores the experience of living with obsessional compulsive disorder. At the height of his OCD, Adam became obsessed with the fear of contracting HIV. This fear led to extreme behaviors. He says this. He said, I would wash my hands until they were red raw. I would panic if I saw a red spot on my skin, convinced it was Kaposi's sarcoma, an age-related cancer. I stopped reading newspapers and magazines because I was terrified of seeing the word AIDS or HIV. I would cross the street to avoid walking past hospitals or clinics. I even stopped watching television, fearing that a news report about HIV might trigger my obsessive thoughts. At my worst, I was checking my body for signs of HIV infection more than 50 times a day. I would wake up in the middle of the night to check. I lost friends because I couldn't explain why I kept cancelling plans at the last minute. I was too ashamed to admit that I was stuck at home, checking my body again and again and again. When people casually refer to themselves as being a little OCD, they're not referring to an experience like Adam's. Instead, they participate in a process of deep trivialization, stripping OCD of its painful reality and reducing it to socially prized traits like neatness and productivity. This distortion mirrors neoliberal ideals that equate worth with success and efficiency, transforming a debilitating condition into a caricature that fits the logic of the marketplace. This process has the effect of silencing OCD sufferers. When individuals with OCD object to this misrepresentation, they risk being dismissed because society has become accustomed to a watered-down version of the reality. Spencer and Carell named the process of casualizing and appropriating diagnosis through trivializing language as wrongful pathologization. To pathologize something is to view a behavior as abnormal, unhealthy, and requiring special treatment. In contrast, to depathologize something is to view the behavior as normal. So it takes a pathological condition and turns it into normal. Now, the thrust of much disability theology and mental health studies is to depathologize disability and mental illness in the name of normalization, justice, and a push against stigma. That, of course, is a very good thing. But in this case, however, the process of depathologization has the exact opposite effect. Wrongful depathologization devalues the epistemic status of people by reducing their symptoms to mere personality traits, thus denying them a fully recognized psychiatric identity. They discuss this in terms of hermeneutic injustice, where people are silenced as knowers, silenced as people who know their own experience, and other people enforce their interpretations onto them. This process of wrongful depathologization stigmatizes and trivializes people's experience at precisely the same time. And to quote them, they say this: they create a twilight zone of mental disorder where the ill person is deemed to both exaggerate their difficulties, trivialization, and to be epistemically suspect because of their psychiatric diagnosis, stigmatization. Thus, people with certain types of mental illness are judged to be too ill to be free of stigma, but not ill enough to be taken seriously. In other words, while the individual is stigmatized for belonging to the marginalized community of the mentally disordered, the disorder itself is a subject of trivialization. Now, this depathologization also affects how other mental illnesses are perceived. Some diagnoses like OCD are viewed as desirable, while others, such as schizophrenia, are less so. So schizophrenia is seen as undesirable because it challenges cultural values like rationality, productivity, individualism, speed, and efficiency. Schizophrenia is a deeply political condition. Though schizophrenia isn't the focus of this lecture, it illustrates how the social context outlined by Rosa can make marginalized people even less desirable. And all of this ties in very closely with Rosa's ideas of social acceleration. Technological acceleration is one of the most potent forces in the evolving mental health landscape I'm describing. One of the reasons language has escaped from the professional realm is that mental health concepts are more widely available than ever via social media. The rise of digital platforms has increased access to information about mental health, bringing once taboo subjects into the public sphere in new ways. While increased visibility of mental health diagnosis can be positive, online communications, the sheer speed of online communications outpace nuance and accuracy. We thus frequently end up with a very thin descriptions of mental health challenges that lack the nuances of professional diagnosis, which emerge slowly over time and require a time-consuming process before they're applied to people's experiences. This increase in information and the casualization of the use of diagnoses has led to a democratization of the diagnostic process and a thinning out of the symptom pool, wherein certain selected features of mental illness are dislocated from their psychological roots, and in this case, in the case of OCD, used to create new watered-down symptoms that fit neatly into the cultural desires of modernity. Non-professionals feel free to linguistically apply diagnostic criteria to themselves or to others without reflecting on what these diagnoses might mean. These thin descriptions lead to the casual deployment of clinical terms and the normalization of trivializing statements. There is therefore a growing awareness of certain conditions, but a simultaneous process of reinterpretation that leads to a damaging superficiality. The acceleration of social change further exacerbates the trend towards casualization. As cultural norms and values evolve at an unprecedented rate, a pace, we witness a growing tendency to normalize and even valorize certain mental health diagnoses, or in the case of recession anxiety, create new ones. This is particularly evident in the case of socially desirable conditions such as OCD, where obsessive tendencies are reframed as desirable traits in a productivity-obsessed world. Now, the situation is amplified and expanded when it moves into the social media. So from casual conversation to TikTok trends. Platforms like TikTok embody Hartmut Rosa's theory of digital acceleration, where mental health narratives are simplified and spread at unprecedented speeds. TikTok's algorithms, driven by user engagement, create a cybernetic loop that exposes individuals to repetitive content about particular mental illnesses. The cybernetic loop refers to a self-reinforcing cycle where individuals are repeatedly exposed to specific content, such as mental health diagnoses, through algorithms. This continuous exposure leads to the internalization of symptoms and identification with conditions without a professional diagnosis. As users adopt these identities, the algorithm reinforces the behavior, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of diagnosis and symptom expression. What once took months or years now occurs in mere days or hours, compressing this process of self-reflection and diagnosis into a quick, superficial engagement with mental health. The rapid dissemination of these narratives serves to reshape how mental illness is understood, commodified, and experienced in the digital age. This cybernetic loop has significant implications for how individuals conceive of and experience mental suffering. On the one hand, it can provide a sense of community and validation for those struggling with mental health issues. People can feel seen, heard, and understood, sometimes for the first time, after encountering content that resonates with their experience. This can lead to an increased awareness, reduced stigma, and meaningful connection. However, the digital construction of mental illness also poses substantial risks. The oversimplification of complex conditions necessitated by the short-form content favored by social media platforms can lead to a superficial understanding of mental suffering. Moreover, constant exposure to content about mental health conditions can potentially exacerbate symptoms or lead individuals to misattribute normal emotional experience to pathological conditions. Like the linguistic construction of mental illness, this form of construction also risks trivializing people's experience. If everyone can choose to have a condition, the suffering of those with a formal diagnosis will inevitably be flattened and trivialized. This democratization of the diagnosis and simplification of symptoms significantly alters the symptom pool. Authority over the legitimacy of symptoms now lies not with medical professions, but with algorithms, online communities, and influencers. People have unprecedented access to symptom description that were once the domain only of professionals. As more individuals share their experience in accessible everyday language or relatable everyday language, these simplified descriptions become part of the collective understanding of mental health conditions, often diverging in important ways from formal medical diagnoses. For instance, studies have shown that some young people, after consuming large amounts of content featuring individuals with Tourette's syndrome or tic disorders, begin to exhibit tics themselves. However, these tics did not follow the typical onset or progression of Tourette's syndrome, prompting researchers to classify the phenomenon as a form of mass psychogenic illness driven by the social media, dubbed TikTok tics. This connection was so pronounced that medical professionals issued warnings about the potential influence of social media on symptom development, particularly in vulnerable individuals. While the tics were real, they did not stem from neurological disorder like Tourette's, but appeared to result from social and psychological factors amplified by social media. In this way, the symptom pool is being reshaped and expanded. The criteria for what qualifies as a legitimate symptom has become blurred, diluted by popular discourse rather than anchored in clinical standards. This dilution is rapidly transforming the mental health landscape in ways previously unimaginable. These reflections on mental illness, These reflections on mental illness's digital and linguistic construction and its impact on the symptom pool highlight Hartmut Rosa's theory of social acceleration in persuasive ways. The rapid spread of mental health narratives on social media illustrates how social acceleration plays out in practice. What once took months or years, the cybernetic looping effect, now happens in days or even hours. This speed profoundly influences how mental health conditions are understood and experienced. In this rapid exchange of digital diagnosis, suffering becomes a label, a commodity traded in cyberspace. The constant stream of new content leads to a fragmented, often superficial understanding of mental health, while the pressure to keep up with the pace exacerbates anxiety and stress. TikTok's algorithms designed to prioritize engagement over depth create a cycle where trending topics quickly replace meaningful connections. This produces a paradox. Individuals find connection and perhaps moments of resonance in shared experience, but struggle to maintain those connections amidst relentless social acceleration, simultaneously feeling both connected and alienated. So having drawn on Rosa's theory of social acceleration to unpack unpack the complexities of self-diagnosis, we now turn to the concept of resonance to explore how it might inform a theological response. A resonant theology of the cross for a digital age. The main theological idea I want to work with in response to these issues is Luther's theology of the cross. I think the dynamics of the cross and glory will help us understand the issues we've been discussing more fully. The theology of the cross is the discipline of finding God's truth and God's action in the least likely places. Luther sharply contrasts the theology of glory with the theology of the cross. The theology of glory seeks knowledge of God through human power, success, and external appearances, with the theology of the cross, which locates the knowledge of God in the suffering and weakness of the cruciform and suffering Jesus. For Luther, the cross is a paradoxical symbol that discloses God's presence precisely in what the world interprets as defeat, failure, and vulnerability. For current purposes, the theology of the cross helps us see where God is in that aspect of suffering we choose to name mental illness. The theology of the cross emphasizes that God's grace and love are most profoundly experienced, not in moments of human achievements, but in suffering and humility. The temptation is always to avert our gaze from the suffering of the cross and seek meaning elsewhere rather than confront the suffering of Jesus head on. Theological constructs like theodicy look beyond the cross for explanations rather than looking at the cross for revelation. Luther urges us to look upon the cross to see Jesus' suffering for what it truly is. So this theology of the cross calls believers to embrace suffering, to recognize the limitations of human strength, and to find their identity and hope in the crucified Jesus. The aspect of this theology that is most helpful here is to call to look at suffering. However, before we can look at suffering, it needs to be made visible. The theology of the cross attunes us to look for suffering in places where it may well be hidden. That's effectively what we've been doing in the first section of this paper. In the theology of the cross, we find a deep alignment with Rosa's idea of resonance. Modernity tempts us to look away from one another and away from suffering. Modernity loves glory. Resonance urges us to slow down, take time to look at people and things, and to identify with them in all circumstances. Resonance involves finding depth, transformative connections with the world, oneself, and others. It's more than just interaction. It requires engagement that changes both parties. Resonance happens when there is a mutual responsiveness, when the world speaks to us and we're moved by it in a way that affects our identity, our understanding, and our sense of belonging. If we take this into the realm of mental suffering, resonance means looking at and being affected by the other. Take, for example, the weaponization of dementia that I mentioned previously. Such linguistic misbehavior closes off the possibility of resonance. If any of you have spent time with people living with advanced dementia, for example, you know what this is like. You know it's necessary to step out of the fast pace of modernity and remain attentive to people in transformative ways. When we do this, we can experience profound moments of deep resonance with individuals who seem to be disconnected from the world. And I suspect that in the area of mental health, these moments of resonance are more frequent than we perhaps think. Gifting time, opening ourselves to transformative relationships, and being present creates a context for resonance that is miles away from the negative rhetoric that fills the political arenas. This opens up space to hear the call of the other and view them in Rosa's words, to be not just of instrumental value, but intrinsically important. When we look at the faces of people with dementia, resonance becomes possible. When we leave behind instrumental time, love becomes an option. When we need to shift from weaponization to invitation. The cross is the heart of resonance. In a resonant theology of the cross, Rosa's theory of resonance is imbued with profound theological significance. The cross becomes the ultimate moment of resonance between God and humanity, where God fully enters into the brokenness of the human condition. Here, God is not distant or detached, but deeply present in suffering. This divine presence, the call that shapes and frames disciples, has the power to transform both the sufferer and the surrounding community. Unlike controlled, predictable experiences, this divine human resonance is unpredictable and uncontrollable, as anyone who has struggled to hold on to God through the challenges of faith knows very well. While we cannot command this resonance, we can prepare ourselves for its possibility through prayer and spiritual formation. At the center of this resonant theology of the cross is Jesus. In Rosa's framework, the cross becomes where God's resonant connection with humanity is most fully realized. Jesus does not bypass suffering, but enters it completely, creating a space where God and humanity meet in the depth of brokenness. This is where true resonance occurs, not in power or control, but in the mutual responsiveness between God and humanity and the shared experience of suffering. A resonant theology of the cross calls the church to enter into this space of suffering and cultivate deep connections with those who dwell there. The power of language in a resonant theology of the cross. At its core, a resonant theology of the cross demands that we confront suffering directly and see it for what it truly is. It's in this call to face the suffering of others that we encounter the anti-resonant force of depathologizing and casual self-diagnosis. By trivializing the suffering of others through language and contributing to the re-stigmatization of those with less desirable diagnoses, we become complicit in profound hermeneutical injustice and choose, whether consciously or not, to look away from suffering. Just to reinforce, by hermeneutical injustice, I refer to Miranda Fricker's observation of the ways in which marginalized people become disenfranchised and downgraded as knowers through the degradation by others of their linguistic contribution. Using trivializing language prevents people with mental illness from being taken seriously as knowers, as people who bear forms of knowledge worthy of respect, value, and action. When we do this, we fail to see people's suffering, and in so doing, we fail to look upon the suffering of Jesus on the cross. Jesus, who invites us to confront suffering directly and without avoidance. Just as the cross reveals the fullness of human suffering, our language should allow us to see suffering of others rather than to diminish or to trivialize it. When we use phrases like, I'm a little OCD, we comply with the pressures of modernity and neoliberal ideology and create a world in which the suffering of those with formal diagnosis is not only trivialized, but is rendered invisible. This trivialization reflects a more profound theological challenge. The refusal to acknowledge suffering in its fullness is a refusal to stand at the foot of the cross. When this happens, the possibility of resonance with those experiencing mental suffering is not only diminished, but it's made impossible. Why? Because we can no longer see them. How can we relate to individuals whose suffering has been made invisible and whose reality we continue to deny? To use Emmanuel Levinas's idea of the face, a resonant theology of the cross insists that we look at the face of the sufferer. For Levinas, the face is not merely a physical appearance, but the expression of the other's vulnerability and humanity. The face presents the other as irreducible, beyond categorization, and calls for an ethical response. It urges us to recognize the other in their fullness and fragility, to become responsible for them, and to respond with care. Or as Rosa puts it, our eyes are windows of resonance. To hear the call of the sufferer, to look into the face of suffering, And to respond with compassion is to open oneself to the possibility of resonance that may transform us. So moving towards the end of what I want to say, I want to think about moving from trivialization to conversation. We need to move from trivialization to conversation. Resonance requires us to see and hear others in their fullness. When we trivialize mental illness, we fail to engage in meaningful conversation around the issues, which leads to a failure of recognition. Without recognition, there can be no resonance. If we do not speak about mental health openly and deeply, we perpetuate the science that renders suffering invisible, causing further isolation and harm. In contrast, entering into honest, thoughtful conversation creates space for recognition, understanding, and the possibility of resonance. These conversations are not just about awareness, but about creating spaces where suffering is truly seen, heard, and responded to with compassion. By engaging in this kind of dialogue, we offer the possibility of solidarity, healing, and transformation. Perhaps the most powerful pastoral strategy the church has is to initiate creative conversations around mental health. The power of our language may seem like a small or trivial action in response to the enormity of mental health challenges, but it is in fact the first step towards taking the cross seriously. So, diagnosing in the digital void. In the realm of digital self-diagnosis, a key theological concern emerges. Diagnoses are made in spaces where genuine, trustworthy faces are absent. Traditionally, diagnosis involves a psychiatrist seeing the face of the patient and in so doing, opening themselves to hear the call of their suffering. Likewise, the patient sees the psychiatrist, feels heard, and experiences a therapeutic exchange rooted in human presence. This mutual encounter holds the potential for resonance. Online diagnoses, however, are devoid of such human connections. They are shaped by faceless algorithms and tech companies, not with the wisdom, experience, and relationships that foster genuine understanding. It's impossible to resonate with an algorithm, or at least I think it is. Even when faces appear online, they're often deceptive, manipulated by digital spaces where it's difficult to discern what's real. With the rise of AI, even face-to-face digital interactions risk becoming suspect, further eroding the possibility of authentic resonance. But there's an underlying problem, and that's the problem of psychiatric aggression. Underlying the issues surrounding diagnosis in the digital realm, and indeed diagnosis in the so-called real world, is a deeper problem, the aggressive nature of the diagnostic process itself. According to Rosa, aggression is a defining feature of modernity. He argues that for late modern human beings, the world has simply become a point of aggression. Everything that appears to us must be known, mastered, conquered, made useful. This aggression stems from a modern society that can only stabilize itself dynamically through constant economic growth, technological acceleration, and cultural innovation. To maintain its status quo, modern society is compelled to bring more and more of the world under its control, economically, technologically, and politically. This involves developing resources, opening markets, and enhancing knowledge and control. In this worldview, the world must first be made visible to be known, mastered, and controlled, which of course is precisely how psychiatry functions. Psychiatric diagnosis serve as a prime example of this aggressive impulse. Diagnosis, whether through professional psychiatry or self-diagnosis, reflects a broader cultural desire to categorize and manage human suffering. In the professional sphere, tools like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual reduce complex mental health experiences to symptoms that can be controlled and fixed. This impulse is mirrored in the lay domain, where platforms like TikTok rapidly democratize diagnosis, turning it into a fluid and ever-shifting phenomenon. People constantly create new symptoms, reshape boundaries, and use psychiatric labels to construct personal identities, seek validation, and feel in control. Both the DSM and the TikTok exemplify a cultural tendency to seek mastery over the uncontrollable aspects of mental illness. However, Rosa's theory of resonance reminds us that authentic human experience, especially suffering, cannot be fully mastered. We must adopt a posture of openness to the uncontrollable, resisting the urge to categorize mental illness into something neat and manageable. Rosa's concept of semi-controllability is key here. It refers to systems or conditions we can influence, but never fully control. Processes shaped by a blend of human agency and autonomous factors. Mental illness shares these characteristics. It cannot be completely mastered, but it can be engaged with meaningfully. This recognition opens space for professional intervention while allowing for resonance in unconventional areas. Importantly, semi-controllability calls for psychiatric humility, the acknowledgement that understanding suffering, mental suffering, can come from sources beyond medicine. This insight challenges us to question whether there might be beneficial aspects to the digital construction of mental health diagnosis. Maybe there's something else going on. The shift from purely medicalized response to recognizing the semi-controllable nature of mental illness marks a move from a paradigm of control towards a more relational and potentially resonant understanding of suffering. Crafting alternative narratives that honor the unpredictability of mental illness and allow for meaning in suffering becomes an act of resistance against the cultural urge to dominate and fix human experience. Perhaps we could think about diagnosis in terms of resistance and lamentation. Self-diagnosis by internet, viewed through the lens of Rosa's theory of resonance, becomes more than just a quest for understanding identity and connection. It's also an act of resistance against professional control over mental health. While this practice has problematic aspects, it may reflect a genuine search for connection, particularly for those without access to professional care. In this context, digital spaces can function as virtual sanctuaries, where individuals voice their struggles and seek solace. From a theological perspective, self-diagnosis and online expression of suffering might be understood as a form of lamentation. Lament in its biblical sense is a profound expression of sorrow directed towards God. On social media, individuals express their suffering similarly, seeking validation and support, much like the psalmist cries for help. These public vulnerabilities foster solidarity and mutual support, mirroring the communal nature of biblical lament, where a community participates in the sufferer's pain. This can be likened in some ways to Jesus' lament from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? In that moment, Jesus experienced divine absence and a profound sense of abandonment. Yet, his cry was a call for resonance and recognition, expressing raw vulnerability. Similarly, digital expressions of suffering are calls for connection, seeking to be heard and understood in a space that often feels absent of true human presence. So, a resonant theology of the cross teaches us that even in moments of perceived abandonment and public vulnerability, there's a possibility of deep connection. So the deep engagement that suffering lament embodies points us back to the cross, the place where divine presence and human suffering meet most profoundly. This resonance between God and humanity is the theological heart of what it means to resist trivialization of suffering in today's world. Just as Christ on the cross took on the fullness of human pain, so too are we called to stand in solidarity with those who suffer, refusing to reduce their experience to the superficial diagnosis and commodified labels of modernity. In a culture that accelerates past suffering, we're invited to pause, pay attention, and cultivate the kind of resonance that leads to transformation. Rather than seeking quick solutions or categorizing human pain, A resonant theology of the cross calls us to stay present in the midst of suffering, recognizing it as a space of divine encounter. This is the radical challenge in an age of digital self-diagnosis, superficial engagement, but one that lies at the core of Christian witness.